This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman. This is London Fintech Podcast, episode 146, brought to you in association with Smart Pension, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Charlie Delingpole, founder and CEO of ComplyAdvantage, who help FS and Fintech with the financial crime problem at several levels. They've clearly been doing this extremely well, as they have some 250 employees in 4 offices around the world. What are the dimensions of these problems from a practical perspective? The first is there are few businesses in the world who really want to help criminals in the first place. The second is in these days of tons of regulation, it's an important business risk if you get it wrong, above and beyond the moral problem. The third, and most practically, a pain that Charlie felt in his prior incarnation as CEO and co-founder of Market Invoice, is that the financial crime problem, money laundering, blah, 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 is a right pain in the derriere for this so-called MLRO, money laundering regulatory officer, I assume, i.e. the poor side in a company that the authorities will pick on to jail if something goes wrong in this area. It's a super example of where limited liability for companies is no longer limited liability. Although solving these problems is core to many organisations and has been going on for donkey's years, it's not always well done. And if you stop to think about it, it can never be perfectly done. The police don't manage great success with many areas of crime themselves. It's also incredibly time-consuming, manual and expensive. So maybe someone clever can get your computer to do it all for you. And on the way to this meeting room, Charlie's introduced me to lots of clever people who have lots of nice computers, or at least lots of nice screens. I couldn't see their computers. Anyway, we'll dive into all this and more. Perhaps most curiously of all for me is how many more orders of magnitude do you need to pay your MLRO to do their day job, but also risk being locked up, unlike the guys they sit next to. Joining a chain gang when things cock up is really going to harm your career. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Hi Charlie, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be here, Mike.
Yes, it's great to be here and it's great to be with you, but it's my first day coming into London in 2020. I mean, firstly, it's incredibly mild. I was very hot, but actually, we're in Covent Garden here. The streets are incredibly dirty. It seemed to need a good wash, actually.
Exactly. I think a baptism of fire, and hopefully we'll clean it up very, very soon for you. Yes,
indeed. So we were talking about podcasts, and you can tell us about your ComplyAdvantage podcast you're launching this year. But also, well, from a business perspective, you're famous, having now formed 3 very successful companies, which you can tell us about in a minute. But one of your siblings is also quite well known in the journalistic world, being a journalist for The Spectator, Inter Alia, but also having a podcast, a few of which actually we listened to over Christmas.
Yeah, so James's Delingpole, which I think has a fair few subscribers now, will be soon eclipsed by our Corrupt Planet podcast, which is set to take over the world with some fascinating content around, I think our latest podcast was on AML-D5, which I think is going to suddenly attract a huge audience, which I'm very excited about.
MLD5.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So I think the kind of 5th European money laundering directive has a very broad audience. So, yeah.
Yes, okay, well, it's certainly in the Delingpole family, you get quite a wide spectrum, as one of the ones we were listening to over Christmas, which I found very interesting, was he had Neil Monnery on, who had written an autobiography of a chap called Camperthwaite, whose first name escapes me, who was the financial secretary in Hong Kong after the Second World War. Unsurprisingly, the Japanese had totally screwed Hong Kong and virtually destroyed the place, and it was an incredibly poor place. He was a very uninterventionist, a very minarchist Treasury Secretary, and an architect of Hong Kong's success in a world of not regulating at all. And my favourite thing that I recall from the podcast was that he banned, after the Second World War, a little bit later, the collection of GNP and other economic data to stop people fiddling around with it.
Yeah, I think the kind of legacy of the British Empire in terms of the kind of international trading hubs like Singapore or the Cayman Islands, I think all of those today are super interesting places in terms of the way in which finance is set up globally, in terms of insurance in the Bahamas or Hong Kong with finance there. So I think even though it was created hundreds of years ago, I think really understanding that legacy and how each different nexus functions is a super interesting place to interrogate in more detail.
Yes, and it's something that's been completely forgotten here, and it's very apposite, as in a couple of weeks' time we will be, quotes, leaving the EU, or they will still have all their ton of regulation. And as I was reflecting in the New Year special podcast previously to this one, the characteristic of this century is absolutely obscene amounts of regulation, and occasionally newspapers or economists will talk about sub-trend growth. It's not unsurprising to me that you have some trend growth if an increasing percentage, I think it's 15% at Citigroup, for example, an increasing percentage of companies all across the economy are busy basically filling out forms for the regulator. There's always been some regulation, but we're in a sort of maxarchistic place. And I referred to Sir Paul Tucker's unelected power, as well as Lord Turner when he was on the show. If you get the last head of the FSA and former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England both saying that regulation has gone mad, it's become micro-supervision rather than some small, big rules. That was the interesting relevance of Hong Kong. They had a few strong rules. It's clearly quite a challenge, and it's going to be quite interesting to see how Britain copes with this when we're out of the EU.
I think the kind of structural drivers of regulatory change are the intensification of globalization and the kind of technological shifts that have driven that. So, for instance, I guess a lot of the fintech boom that you kind of document on the podcast is driven by this shift away from branch-based banking, but also the way in which business is becoming much more international. And I think, therefore, regulation has to change, and therefore technology has to then embrace that change at the same time. So I think, as well as that, you have this kind of long-term structural shift away from people being tolerant of bad things and a much stronger moral fibre, at least an evolving moral fibre in terms of what's acceptable, right? So, which is driven by public opinion. So I think once you begin to unpack what regulation is and the rest dimensions, then I think it's a reasonably complicated and multifaceted issue.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, you've sort of rolled quite a few smoke bombs across the table at that point, and it's quite hard to see through the mist. I mean, in terms of whether people are getting more moral, it'd be quite interesting to have your brother on the podcast at this point, because you would have his own perspective, being a culture warrior himself. And I think you're quite right, of course, about the globalisation aspect, in that going back to when I started in the city in 85, it was still old school. I mean, literally old school. It was sort of mainly public school for, corporate finance and bankers and that kind of stuff, and the traders were more sort of East Endy type people, but a sort of kind of tradition that had been going on for centuries. And it was easier to for example, sort out stockbrokers. If all the stockbrokers come from a similar background, they all knew each other and they were interested in keeping the market going. But I think counter to your point, the globalisation has been happening first, and the global regulation has been happening first with banking regulation. So I was amazed when Tucker said that in the 70s, the Bank of England didn't even have a mandate to supervise banks. Astonishingly, there was nothing written. Informally, they keep an eye on the city, of course. And Basel I, I think, only came in 1990s. And going back to Camperthwaite, Basel I had some simple rules, simple, crude rules, which had the advantage that they could be remembered, and I could remember them. And then you had Basel II and Basel III, and Turner was chairing one of the committees on Basel III. And the point isn't, which it always comes down to, do you need regulation? Yes, you always need regulation. The point is, you need good regulation. And there is a strong argument that the type of regulation by minutiae is completely the wrong regulation, and that there are simpler ways which will actually be for the good of society by making economic growth around the world. Anyway, this is a slightly sort of theoretical argument, in that if one puts it along the way that, yes, we need regulation, but we want good regulation, you need then some metric of measuring whether a certain type of regulation is good or not, and one of them is volumes. And again, going back to James's podcast, another one we listened to over Christmas was Dominic Frisby, and my goddamn book, which should have been finished before Christmas, Don't Mention the War. It's now been typeset, and I've got the final typeset to read through it again. It's amazing how fed up you can get of your own work once you've read it 58 times. But I want to sneak a sentence in, and I know the people who are doing it are not going to let me, but I'm going to have a little argument about it. Because the one sentence from the podcast which stuck in my mind. So you might argue, and you throw lots of smoke bombs out and try and confuse me, that it's necessary to have a tax code, and in this globalising tech, moral, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Yes, it is necessary to have a tax code. However, in the last 20 years in the UK, the tax code has increased sixfold. It is now 6 times longer. Does that serve you or I, or does that serve the Goldman Sachs and the Googles of the world? We're making a world fit for the big four accountants and the corporates. And I think it's from Dominic's book, which I know you've read. I think the stat was that under Gordon Brown, the length of the tax code tripled. George Osborne came in, said he'd going to reduce it, and actually he doubled it. So the overall point, I mean, you deal with the world the way it is. I can take a bit more of a sort of step back and say that to get economic growth going forward, which is super important. I mean, the Conservative Manifesto did say we're going to have a bunch of free ports around the UK which won't be taxed. So it's absolutely relevant to look at the examples of Hong Kong and all these kind of things. So it's, yes, simple, clear, effective regulation as opposed to regulation by minutiae. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. So I think I'm completely right, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So I think once you kind of look at the core substance of these things, like tax is fundamentally about money and the kind of power that yields from that, right? So I think bureaucracy goes back to like the very foundation of societies in Mesopotamia, or kind of like Max Weber in the 1800s. So I think all these concepts aren't new concepts, but I think the kind of intellectual clarity you can provide by simply saying that things should be simple, or need to kind of arrest like structural atrophy within the tax code to make things more simple. I think to the extent that you can reimagine the way things should be, then I think like absolutely. I think like if there's been a long-term decline in the quality of regulation, then I think fresh thinking is required.
Absolutely, and a knife can kill or a knife can heal in the hands of a surgeon, and it is tech that is the problem. You talk about ancient Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's code, which was mostly commercial precedent really, was on a 4-ton steel, and it was carved. So if you had to carve your bleeding legislation into a 4-ton steel, it took some time. So you're a bit careful about the words. A bit like when you could only send one text on a phone, you compressed it quite a lot. And one reason is not just Brown and Osborne. One reason the tax code has increased 6 times in length, that's ridiculous, over the last 20 years, whilst, of course, the Facebooks and the Amazons pay bugger all tax, while the citizens have to pay all their tax, is simply because of tech. When I started in the city and computers didn't talk to each other and nobody really had a computer anyway, nobody could possibly practically think of making a tax code 6 times longer. So on the one hand, computers and all this kind of stuff means you can have far, far longer stupid documents. On the other hand, and this is presumably where you guys come in, that gives you a chance to actually be an antidote to it.
So for us, like in terms of the vast majority of your listeners, I guess, in terms of people who are passionate about fintech, like the kind of fundamental thing that unites all fintechs is that they will have customers and they will have transactions, and they will have customers from all over the world, right? So for monies, for instance, explicitly they're targeting recent migrants, right? And so at any given point, a new bank can have clients from anywhere in the entire world, right? And so as we know, there are many threats out there. It could be the Colombian guerrillas, FARC, it could be the IRGC, it could be Qasim Soleimani's like henchmen. So, and then there's a range of regulations which stipulate that you aren't allowed to finance Venezuelan exfiltration of state funds. You aren't allowed to finance Syrian chemical weapons plants, right? And therefore, in that respect, every single listener will have fought with and probably lost this battle around efficiently and effectively being able to deal with that structural problem.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I mean, we're talking about tactical and strategic. If I was working for a fintech this afternoon, of course I deal with the world the way it is.
Yeah.
Taking a step back, as I have just reviewed a decade and listened to all this stuff by Frisbee and about Camperthwaite, it's very clear that one of the things we need to be far more careful about as a country, and it is something that's on our agenda this year and in the manifesto, is to try and do all the things you talk about, but in a simpler, clearer way. That has always been the great advantage of the UK commercially from the 16th century when we invented the company going forward. Now, talking of invented companies, you invented loads of really good companies. How did you do that? And how does everyone else do that? Yes. If they want to go and invent loads of really good companies this afternoon. You started quite early.
Yeah, so I guess like I kind of started my first company when I was 16, and again, that was kind of problems that were around me, and it was kind of stuff that I enjoyed, and again, it was the kind of application of technology to interesting problems. So
this company, many of the younger listeners will have heard of as it is.
Yeah, so the Student Room is kind of a well-known, I guess, for anyone kind of who's been at university in the past like 20 years. They kind of all know that.
And for people who can't remember when they went to university, what is the Student Room?
So it's basically a website where you can talk to other students, basically. So kind of mainly around like university and those kind of issues. And that's kind of now like a 100-person company.
And are you still involved with it?
So I'm still on the board for the past 19 years now, I guess.
How long were you doing that? Was that a part-time project?
And that was all whilst I was at school.
Right, so it's a bit of a sort of Zuckerberg-y thing.
Yeah, so one of our investors says that you could have won the Olympics, instead you won the school egg and spoon race, to the extent that it was prior to Facebook, right? So yeah, I mean, obviously it wasn't the same scale as Facebook.
Yes, but it's been of great social benefit. I mean, I know when you go to Waitrose like me that people ask you for money and you need to make that.
Yeah.
But also, it's been a good thing, really.
Yeah, I think in terms of broadening access to universities and helping people understand what's around them, that I think played a great role.
Exactly, and the young generation in this tech age are infinitely more stressed than they've ever been, and mental health problems are a real issue, and being able to discuss with a community of people some of these challenges is of infinite benefit. Right, so having started by doing social good, your career went downhill because then you got into FS for some reason. So how did that shift happen?
So I did tech, media and telecoms banking at JP Morgan. I guess because in running the student room, I realised that I didn't know how to run a company and it was quite complex, and so therefore I wanted to learn, and therefore I guess just to be able to work with internet companies at massive scales to understand how to finance, how to analyse, how to understand the business, that was the kind of rationale for the education.
Right, okay, and then one day you woke up in the morning with your mate Anil and said, oh, well, let's form market invoice. Oh, okay. And then what does that do? And you go and have a coffee and you work it all out from there. What made you do that? What made you leave JP Morgan, a proper job?
I guess the intention was always to go and start a company, but hopefully one that was kind of bigger, right? So, and I guess 2009, there was no fintech. It was just kind of invoice finance or banking, but then it suddenly, I guess to your point around doing things which kind of ostensibly are boring, but doing them well, it became fintech and it became sexy, right? So that was the same vintage of companies as Funding Circle and TransferWise. Yeah, all of them were starting at the same time. So
was there actually a community in those days? Did you know about this company called RateSetter or this company called Funding Circle?
Yeah, so we'd all kind of present at the same panels, and I saw Christo, he was around the corner in Shoreditch, and we helped him with PR when he was 4 people, right? Christo was from TransferWise. So all these companies, we're all the same size, i.e. we're all kind of 5 people at the start, right?
Did any of you have any idea that 5 or 10 years later it would be such a thing? As opposed to aspirations or hopes?
I think everyone had huge aspirations, right? Everyone had big opportunity costs, as in everyone gave up
real jobs.
Yeah, as in I think at the time it was far less sexy to do that, as in everyone was what are you doing? You had a great job.
I gave up my big job in '98. Everyone thought I was completely mad because nobody else did, apart from hedge funds.
Yeah.
I think hedge funds were the earliest thing where people went off and did their own stuff, but often they went off and did their own stuff with $1 billion to manage on day one, which makes things a little easier.
Yeah. So I think there was far less investors, far less VC, the ecosystem was far less developed. It was far more of a kind of unknown thing back then. I think now it's terribly fashionable, terribly well known, it's a kind of standard thing. There are many kind of great reference case studies of people doing really well. So I think back then it was kind of unconventional, but it was something that we wanted to do.
And in terms of the early days and how we got from sort of 2010 to about 2014 when the Fintech podcast started, which I think was London's first Fintech week, and the mainstream media started, or the broadsheets anyway, started using the phrase Fintech in their newspapers in about 2014. So it sort of hit upon the radar horizon. I would have assumed that one of the reasons was light touch regulation, and not to mention the theme in the morning, but that another was to quite a large extent that George Osborne created a relatively positive environment for it. If you had a pie chart and you had to sort of just give me 3 or 4, slices of that pie chart, let's take as point 1, so you didn't have to be modest, that you were all brilliant geniuses and you're really going to make things happen regardless. So, okay, so that's a quarter of the pie chart. What are the other 3 quarters then?
Structural causes of the kind of Cambrian explosion of fintech. So I think in 2009, drivers were perception that the banking industry, broadly construed, had failed. As in, I think the same reasons why there are huge fines now in terms of regulatory fines, billions of dollars a year. There was this perception of bad behavior and malfeasance. And also, because the industry was so concentrated, I think innovation had slowed, right? So I think people perceived it to be structurally weak. I think London, as the kind of leading global financial hub, had thousands and thousands of different niches, each of which were done badly, and at the same time, the kind of costs of launching a company were declining in terms of you had things like Amazon Web Services, you had all kinds of technology coming out, you had the resurgence of technology internationally. And so I guess specifically why it began here was you had the people, you had the technology, you had the capital, and you also had the beginnings of some success stories happening, right? And so I think as people saw it working, they began to interrogate more and more different spaces, as in breaking down the market map of different industries and verticals. And also I think that kind of built upon itself in that people had built out the infrastructure, as in people who had launched in phase one could then help and advise, and also built out some of the APIs and foundations. So it was people building a community, like in the same way that Boston has life sciences or Silicon Valley had all kinds of social media companies. This kind of critical mass and cluster of companies. So like one of the points you made was kind of, it shouldn't be the London Fintech podcast, it should be the UK Fintech podcast. But I think the counterpoint to that would be actually you need people around who can draw upon their experience, draw upon their lessons. And like in terms of would Facebook have launched if Justin Timberlake's representation hadn't have helped him out in the movie, like in terms of Friendster, right? So I think like you're always standing upon the shoulders of giants and other failures who can help you launch.
Right, okay, so that takes you through to 2014 when the podcast started, or whenever it was, and then obviously Market Invoice had got going then, and you thought, this has got going, so I'll start all over again. I've struggled for years. Yeah. That was actually quite fun with hindsight. I should go and struggle for years again. What was the motivation at that point to found ComplyAdvantage?
So I think in being at Market Invoice, like if you're building a fintech, then you want to grow the company, right? You're probably burning cash, or you're probably investing very heavily. And at the back of your mind, you're like, okay, I actually took upon this legal responsibility for being a money laundering reporting officer, as in I'm liable specifically by name, according to the FCA or HMRC, and I will go to jail.
So on that point, back to my curiosity, in a rational world, and I'm never sure that people are rational, but never mind, we'll find out whether you're rational as a specific example. If I were you and I was sitting next to Anil and I'm saying, well, one of us is going to go to jail if things go wrong. Do you want to do it? And he says, nah. And I said, do you want to do it? Well, not really. So, well, how much is it going to take? I'd say, well, about 10 times what you're paid, mate. Or you just sort of nice, dumb, insert whatever word you want. And you say, I'll be legally responsibility. I'll join a chain gang if somebody in this company messes up, but I won't ask for any more money. I mean, do MLRAs not get paid 10 times the amount?
There was an article in the FT about a year ago saying that they were kind of like highly paid American football stars. They have short, highly paid, explosive careers, and they get injured and they're out of the game. So, yeah, I think to the extent that there's the piercing of the veil in terms of personal liability rather than corporate liability, I think it is unique, but that's because of the kind of scale of the threat.
So joking apart, the salaries for MLROs are higher because they run higher personal risk.
There's high because of high personal risk, but also high because of demand, right, and also because of the importance, right? So I mean, like for instance, like if you look at the headcount breakdown of most fintechs, the biggest team will either be customer support with B2C, or it'll be compliance, as in there's huge demand, and that's because both the industrial bureaucratic process they have to administer, as well as the legal liability, like long tail, false negative, missed $1 billion fines element is a huge problematic concern. So the driver isn't just the fact that you'll go to jail and why do I want to do this, but also because it's hard and because it's very costly.
Right, okay, so any of you out there that's looking for a new job in 2020 that's going to pay more, and you want a highly paid, high risk, something where you'll never be bored, maybe you should think of MLROing. I can imagine nothing worse myself, but fortunately I'm beyond that kind of stage. So let's look at this whole area. Let's put the sort of fact that regulation could be a million times shorter and everyone's life would be easier. It isn't. So we deal with the world as it is, not as the world as we would wish it to be. Let's, for the moment, assume that the word crime is simple. In our minds, crime is simple because you see an old lady being beaten over the head. That's a crime. In reality, there's a spectrum from that kind of bad thing or people trafficking or something to the other end where you've got sort of the global empire of America using economic warfare against the countries it doesn't like, and therefore it describes sort of trading with them as crimes, and as Standard Chartered found out, woe betide you if you go against the global imperium. But anyway, so let's start by assuming that crime is simple. You mentioned false positive, false negative there. As I mentioned in the introduction, the police don't catch every criminal, so why should you as an MLRO be expected to catch every criminal in your fintech? or large bank? Or does the regulator cut you some slack and says, well, as long as you catch 90% of the sort of money launderers?
Good question. So I think there's a spectrum in terms of you can't be complicit, as in, I think where people have gone to jail, where companies have been shut down, I think some of those companies have been complicit in that particular crime. I guess others have been kind of ignorant or had structural processes or failures in their system. But then even with the best efforts basis, right? So if you're a large global bank and you're doing, say, 2.5 billion payments a year, right? And of those, you get 100 million matches, of which they can be either false positives or false negatives, which require investigation, each of which will cost, say, $200.
So one second. So just defining terms for those people who don't know them. A false positive is that, for the sake of argument, you're monitoring Monzo's transactions. I use Monzo card, and I come up as Mike's a criminal because podcasters are well known to be dodgy geezers, and you've got to process that and work out whether I am actually a criminal or not. That's a false positive. A false negative is that I didn't come up on your thing and I actually am a criminal and you've missed me. Is that right?
Exactly.
And going back to some kind of statistical grasp around this, in terms of where the industry is now or where it was 5 or 10 years ago, let's go 20 years ago, ages ago, before all this kind of stuff blew up in the way it is now. If you were a Barclays Bank, should we say, a couple of decades ago, what's the kind of path of the course in terms of false positives and false negatives? Is it 1%, 10%, 50%, 0.001%? I have no idea.
So it kind of varies, right? So it depends on the breadth of data that you're searching. So if you're, say, solely obliged to search against the US Treasury, the OFAC list, then that's kind of like...
So the OFAC list being...
the Office of Foreign Assets and Control. So basically, that's the kind of sanctioned entities database. So, for instance, Hussein Soleimani and Jawad Zarif, the kind of IRGC leader, and the Iranian foreign minister are both sanctioned entities, right? So, therefore, they're subject to an asset freeze and travel ban, and therefore you can't allow them to transfer their assets via any institution which adheres to OFAC jurisdiction.
So, putting the politics to one side, because it will be countries like Iran and Russia that America doesn't like. But anyway, if your requirement as an organisation is to check against this list, it's a fairly defined procedure. And apart from getting the typos in names and that kind of stuff, it should be fairly easy to check that Mike Balliman isn't on that list.
Apple, for instance, were fined millions of dollars about a month ago because one of their counterparties, SIS 000, is a Slovenian app developer, and they were also trafficking drugs, right? So that probably was through misconfiguration of name matching. So although you say that kind of like...
it's easier said than done. How hard can it be?
As in, you met a team next door, all they were doing is the different configurations and name matching, because they're kind of so many different permutations and then address matching to the extent that...
Delve into this example, and you may not know, but the details, but taking Apple as an example, this comes back to my what is the regulator's standard? Yeah? If the police were held to the standard of catching 100 criminals and never arresting a wrong person, they'd all be in jail themselves. Therefore, Fintechs or banks or Barclays or Apples or whoever cannot be held to a standard of 100% perfection. So were Apple really fined because they just made a mistake? I mean, we all know in the world of tech and computers or just life, mistakes happen.
Yeah. So how do regulators determine the fines to be levied and the quantum? So I think that's an assessment based upon the scope and the scale and magnitude of the transgression. So I guess if you look at Danske Bank or Commonwealth Bank or Apple or any of the recent fines, I think regulators take into account the kind of length of the transgression and then the impact. And so if they're convinced that all possible efforts were applied and the kind of attack vector was imperceptible and impossible for them to counteract, then they will then take that into account when they're being fined. If it was kind of willful negligence or incompetence, then they'll come down far harder. But irrespective of the magnitude or causation, we know that these fines are billions of dollars a year and only getting larger.
And of course, the press always reports these as fines on the company. They are not fines on the company, they are fines on the shareholder who've had nothing to do with it and minimal control. Okay, so that's the context. So historically, before ComplyAdvantage changed the world forever, how did people approach it? And then we'll move on to how the likes of ComplyAdvantage and other people doing similar approaches to you guys have changed the world forever and made the thing presumably cheaper, better, faster, all the usual kind of stuff like that.
So I guess the reason why I started the company partly was because I walked into our first client in Mayfair and I just saw their kind of process system. So this company was international payments company sending money to Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan.
Quite high-risk areas where you need to be careful with your matching.
Yeah, so ISIS, Al-Shabaab, Taliban, right? And so at the same time, these communities wouldn't be able to fund their existence, as in, like, you couldn't feed your family without the money being transferred via remittances. So, you look at, like, the Philippines or Mexico, these economies rely very heavily on their expatriate communities to remit funds back, right? So, but therefore, this triage dimension of understanding which payment is bad or not was critical, but the systems were done very badly. At JP Morgan, my clients were companies that were in the space, as in Reed Elsevier, Reuters, Dow Jones. So I kind of knew them and understood them. And also, I guess from my first company, I understood the technology, and I personally like coded data pipelines, and I kind of like, so when I walked into that first client, I could see precisely the problem and the solution. But I think the issue is that the solution required massive investment and the scale and perfection. So the nuance is post 9/11, databases developed of people and companies that were threats, kind of edited by people like WorldCheck, right? So what I wanted to build was a kind of live, real-time, dynamic algorithm system rather than a system whereby 400 analysts manually collate profiles of people, right? So it was kind of AI-driven pipeline for assessing and analyzing risk in real time and algorithm improvement rather than kind of manual. So, I mean, it was a structural refoundation of the entire system, right? Because the solution wasn't just the cosmetic enhancement, it was kind of rebuilding everything from scratch.
Right. So is there an analogy there between the progress of credit risk assessment from decades ago, where if you went into Clive Watt's credit department decades ago, you would find a bunch of files on the wall with information in, and you'd have people who are adding information, taking it away, assessing it, and then saying that, lending ComplyAdvantage or a B+ on their rating scheme or something like that. Fast forward, as we've heard on the podcast a number of times, now, quotes, computers, unquotes, can actually do a lot of that credit assessment better. And so back in the day, there was less focus on this kind of stuff, but people still didn't want to deal with criminals, but you had the same kind of thing, which is you would have people sitting in a room with lists of stuff themselves. And now, just fast forwarding, you're doing, the parallel thing, which is automating crime risk assessment, just in the same way that, quotes, credit risk assessment is automated.
I mean, the analogy that I like is this distinction between two benefits or forms of machine learning, in that they're like interns, right? As in, the kind of first dimension of machine learning can be an intern who's able to, it's like kind of firing up 1,000 interns who can spend the whole weekend going through documents manually, right? And so rather than using interns for that, you can use an algorithm. There's that benefit. But then there's a kind of, say, a person you can hire who can go and look through 10 million documents and see everything that's been seen ever before in the past, and then come up with insights and recommendations that were never possible before. And so I think both are beneficial and both could lead to huge step changes in the way in which we kind of manage financial crime.
And I think one of the things that sort of most impressed me wandering around, seeing some of your clever people out there, was that one of them was responsible for a number of desks and computers and people who seemed to be sort of trying to create a database of roughly everything in the world ever to do with people. And what struck me, rather like Tristan Fletcher last year talking about tracking all of the cargo containers around the world and what they're all containing, is that one thing that's changed over the past decade since when you started in the fintech world is that the scale of computer cleverness or availability or whatever you want to call it, or techniques, means that private companies can now do what states only could do 10, 20 years ago. GCHQ has been doing all this crap for ages. I'm sure of it. I've raised the question once or twice in the podcast and never had a right answer, which is that if the government really cared about this and if the government really cared about business, then it could provide a centralised identity thing or a centralised name check. You could send Mike Balliman to some API at GCHQ and he said, a complete jerk, don't deal with that guy or something, yes or no. And they could remove this, going back to simpler regulation, whole thing if they wish, because they have, don't tell me they don't keep some track of who the goodies and baddies are in the world. Anyway, that's a sort of curious thing about why they don't. But my point is that 10 or 20 years ago, you needed to be the size of the United States or the United Kingdom to actually do something. Now you can hire some clever people and they can get a long way along that chain of doing, 90% of what GCHQ can do, or 99%, I don't actually know. But
I'd say, So this company I started 5 years ago now, 6 years ago really, and the scale we need to be able to do this and the level of investments, we've raised $40 million now. I think last year we spent a very large sum of money, right? I think in terms of the people required and the spend on data and cloud and the level of sophistication and the level of the amount of stuff we do in terms of the architecture and the system and even things which can take a year in terms of scalability or refactoring, the scale we have now is pretty big, right? In terms of we're doing this for how many hundred clients, we're doing how many 100 million searches every day, the amount of code we write, the amount of cloud spend we have, the amount of pages we bring in is kind of to build what we built now in terms of the cost and the number of people and the time, and I don't know how many governments have teams of this size and scale and expense, right? So in terms of the amount of money we've spent, the amount of time doing it, and to build something we built is kind of ferociously hard, I think.
Absolutely. No, I wasn't in any sense trying to undervalue what you do. And I don't actually know G6Q, although a thingy whose name escapes me from Balderton did actually work at GCHQ. It was more that I think it's quite staggering and something that had been hard to imagine even a decade ago.
Yeah.
That it is possible for a brilliant guy like you in a brilliant firm like this to actually do something of this in order of magnitude. I would never have imagined it possible 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's not easy, but...
Yeah, I think in terms of the kind of skills that exist in London, in terms of machine learning, in terms of cloud, in terms of the infrastructure available, in terms of the kind of scale of clients and the kind of aggregation effects, right? I mean, one of the things that I felt was that there's no way that any single company will ever want to build what we built themselves, in terms of you need to be able to spend so much money and spend so much time configuring it that you need to have one company building it for everyone, and you need to have that perfected, right? So I guess part of what motivates me and us at ComplyAdvantage is trying to eliminate financial crime, as in eliminate human trafficking and terrorism and wildlife trafficking, because the way to eliminate evil is by stopping the money, right? Or stopping clients transacting. And therefore, I think in terms of being able to build one system that the whole world can use to stop all these things once and for all, I think that's quite motivational.
Yes, and I shall, in my post-Christmas merriment, try and be disciplined, and I shall try and avoid suggesting that the way to eliminate evil might be to massively constrain nation-states as such, insofar as if you look at all the murdering that's happened in the world, I assume that 99.999% of murdering has been state-sponsored, whether it be the Second World War or the First World War or various other wars. Let's not go down that particular one. Right, okay, so look, before we wrap up the show, we need to know a little bit more about ComplyAdvantage. We've been sort of dancing around the handbag slightly. We shall rip off more of your 7 metaphorical veils, Charlie, and talk about what you've got. Before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there. I'd like to give a special shout out to the MLROs. I hope you're getting paid 10 times what your colleague is getting paid, and maybe Charlie can persuade you soon that if you buy his stuff, I'm not quite sure what his stuff is, but if you buy some of his stuff, that it'll keep you out of the jail and being a football player free of injuries for much longer. I'd also like to thank my brand partners for the podcast, Smart Pension, who are fast, secure and free. Check out their UK workplace pensions at autoenrolment.co.uk. So, Charlie, time's gone by. I've had to restrain myself once or twice from saying that it's all down to the state, and that maybe if you shut down the CIA and the KGB and all these kind of things, we'll get rid of lots of crime, but let's not go down there. The world is what the world is. Banks, other financial organisations, Fintechs have the practical problem, and certain individuals in these companies are at risk in going to jail if they don't follow regulations. If they are what they are. You've referred to the fact that you guys have been working really hard. You've got some scale. You're in, I think, New York, London, Singapore and Romania. You've grown to scale over 6 years. You must have been writing some pretty clever computer programs. But I think what the listeners may not have understood yet is, so what have you built then, Charlie?
Yeah, so I guess every fintech company should be using us for 3 core things, right? Firstly, when they onboard a client, they have to check the client if they're bad or not using us. So they can ping the client's name to us, company or person, via an API and get a response back immediately. Secondly, once they have that client, they need to understand will that client then become bad, right? Has that client joined a terrorist group, right? As soon as they join a terrorist group, we will then send an alert back to their system saying, hey, this client is now bad. And then thirdly, once they begin transacting, is understanding that behavior, as in if they start sending money to like Iraq, or if they do something very different to what they said they do when they became onboarded, then we build a system that helps alert clients to that. And then I guess the second thing is, which types of alerts do you want in terms of which data sets, right? So it's sanctions. So has Trump said that that client of yours is subject to an asset freeze and travel ban and therefore is illegal to transact with? So sanctions. Secondly, political exposure. So the EU fifth money laundering directive came in this week, and therefore you are, as a fintech, you're legally obliged to apply enhanced diligence procedures to all political exposure clients, which we have. Thirdly, adverse media, right? So Mike Ballerman ran a terrorist attack, therefore you'll get an alert as soon as that's reported, right? So therefore onboarding, monitoring, and transaction monitoring, sanctions, PEPs, adverse media, all those things every fintech needs. We do it for most fintechs in London, but perhaps there are some that we don't do it for, or some people who work in banks or insurance companies or corporations, or every company in the world, even Apple, isn't allowed to do business with bad people, and therefore every fintech company in the world or bank in the world should use us for that.
And how many clients do you have at the moment, roughly?
So we have kind of 500 clients directly, and then probably a lot more via partners who resell our data and services.
And fintechs from your early days in Market Invoice will have been doing anti-money laundering and blah, 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 one way or another.
Yeah.
What is it that you guys have? What are your USPs? What is it that you've built that means that you're better than most or better than everybody?
So we would argue it's about efficiency and effectiveness. It's about not missing the bad guys and not getting too many false positives. So ease of integration, robustness of the technology, and faster, better, not necessarily less expensive though.
Well, you get what you pay for, don't you, really? Like you go and buy a motor car, then you'll get a car in line with your budget. But I'm just curious how these kind of contracts work. So let's say on the podcast I start charging, I don't know, start charging everybody $1 somehow to listen to the podcast, or I pay them $1 or something. And then I need to sort of check out that all the listeners are kosher or blah, blah, blah. I haven't upset Trump, although Trump doesn't worry about upsetting people himself. And I come to ComplyAdvantage and I say, oh yes, I like to use your stuff because I've got the problems you outlined. Is there kind of some kind of, I don't know, SLA or something that says, well, actually, you should expect using our stuff, Mike? Because I would say, well, what should I expect? You're not going to assume, say, we will guarantee you 100% success.
Yeah.
Because nobody can guarantee 100% success. How does that angle work? I assume if I've got a sort of beauty parade of ComplyAdvantage and 2 or 3 others doing what you do, I'll sort of say, okay, so I can work out, you can tell me your cost, I understand that, I know what sort of $1 million a day is, I got that bit, how well do you do it? So if you're in a beauty parade like that, how do you answer, how well do you do it?
So we would look at the different features you want around kind of the ability to triage data more effectively, to be able to match names more effectively, to get monitoring more effectively, to be able to understand if this counterparty is actually the right person you want to deal with. So I think there are various kind of quantitative assessment criteria that people use, and we've invested very heavily in making sure that we kind of become far better, but also different in terms of the way in which they're compared.
Right, okay, we're not asking a question about you, but just to give me a feel. Across the industry as a whole, old school and new school providers of these kind of services, is the accuracy 50%, 90%, 99%? I just have no feel for it.
So the issue is you're trying to track 9 billion people, each of which could be a threat, right? And the old way of doing it was to kind of have 400 people in a room in Malaysia tracking them manually, right? For me, that never worked, right? And then also in terms of understanding where data is from and being able to understand who this person is, the level of detail. And given that any fintech will have massive teams doing this, right? To get this system, in order to reduce the amount of hours spent per person, but also to actually catch the bad people, you need to have a really good system. So
10 years ago, when all these firms, RateSetter, Funding Circle, blah, 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 they're all blue chip, they're all trying to do their best. In the first few years, what percentage accuracy did they get on false positives or false negatives or just slipping through the net?
The vast majority of matches are going to be false positives.
Right, which is just, to be clear, which is just at an expense for the company. It's not a risk. You don't go to the jail. It's just you've got to go through the folder of Mike Balliman manually. So it's a cost to you. So those are just a cost. It's the false negatives where you miss a bank robber.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So how accurately can that be done 10 years ago? And is it 10 times better now? Was it sort of 90% accurate for the sake of argument? In 2010, Fintechs in 2010, did they capture 90% of the baddies and now they capture 99% or 50 and 75? I've no feel.
So the old mechanism was like painting the fourth bridge, right? In terms of as soon as you finish collecting information and then comparing it to yours, you'd have to start again. Whereas we think we found a solution to this whole problem, as in we will carry on improving our algorithms until they're perfect, right? And once we've done that, we will completely eliminate false positives and false negatives.
Good. Right. Okay. Well, how hard can that be? I'll show you finish that by Christmas. We'll come back when you're at 100% accuracy. The show's talked about two things, which is just the strategic level, where I'm in no doubt that we need simpler, clearer regulation, legislation all around, whether it's tax or banking or financial crime. At a tactical level, it doesn't really matter. The world is what the world is. It is certainly a huge problem for companies, and just speaking to the people that you've got beforehand, I'm extremely impressed by the level and intensity of intelligence that's going into making this problem more tractable and to doing it at higher levels of efficiency. And it's certainly clear to me from just a little walk around one of the floors of one of your offices that basically, certainly for fintechs and probably for many medium-sized banks and possibly some of the larger ones, you'd have to be a bit insane to try and do all this yourself. As you explained, it's such a big thing to do to create the stuff that you've created. You really are better off, for the sake of argument, taking Smart Pension, sticking to pensions and outsourcing this kind of stuff to somebody else.
I think, given the amount of complexities and nuances to it, which I didn't appreciate when I first launched the company, are astounding. And had I known actually how hard it was,
you probably wouldn't have started.
Yeah, I think just in terms of to reach perfection and to build the data set is extremely, extremely hard, and therefore even 6 years and how many £100 million in we are, it's kind of still not an easy problem to solve.
Excellent. Right. Okay. That's very clear. I'm very glad I'm not an MLRO. I'm glad I'm not in this kind of world, but some of the listeners will be MLROs, and all businesses have to deal with this stuff. As you say, even Apple has got fined these days. So I definitely feel that they should check out ComplyAdvantage and see whether you guys can help them. So I wish you every success in the future, Charlie, and Happy New Decade to you.
Happy New Decade, Mike.
Thanks for listening. If you have consulting, advisory/non-exec or media needs in the FS or Fintech space, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
We could sit in a band there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. To come away from the city with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.